Welcome to Bonn Park. I'm Sarah Geidlinger.
And I'm Marshall Ward.
And I'm Betty Anne Keller, the producer of Rock This Town, which is a 60-minute documentary film about the history of popular music here in Kitchener-Waterloo. Can't wait to share it with you.
Rock This Town is playing at the Princess Twin Cinema in Waterloo.
On Thursday, March 24th at 7 p.m., Saturday, March 26th at 2 p.m., and Sunday, March 27th at 2 p.m. See you there.
Welcome to Bonn Park.
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 Do us a favor.
Can you please leave us a 5-star review, like or subscribe to our show, and share with your friends? We'd also love it if you followed us on social media.
We are a homegrown community project, and every bit helps. On with the show. This is it.
Bonn Park is supported by Indigo Tutoring and Consulting. The award-winning team at Indigo Tutoring and Consulting loves helping kids. While Indigo specializes in support for students with learning disabilities and autism, they support students in all subjects and grades, including college and university courses. The goal is always the same, to provide the kind of academic and emotional support that will help students achieve their full potential. Indigo works with you to find an ideal tutor for support at home, at their center, or a location that suits your needs. There's no one-size-fits-all approach to learning. Sometimes a little one-on-one time with a supportive educator makes all the difference to a growing mind. Find out more at indigo-tutoring.com. Betty Anne Keller, thank you so much for joining us today.
This is my pleasure.
We are super excited to talk to you. I'm going to tell a little story here. We were recording at the Hoffman studio at KPL with Dave McPherson about his book about Massey Hall. We were having a great time. And once we hit stop, I said, why doesn't anybody do anything about this local scene, this rich local scene that we've had that includes blues and rock and all of these folk artists and so much stuff that made me the person that I am today because I got to enjoy it in my youth. And Marshall and Dave looked at me like I was nuts and they said, Betty Anne Keller is doing that. Like everyone knows except for me. So I've been living under a rock during these last 2 years, I suppose. So man, was I excited to hear that. We are, what I learned is that you and Marshall know each other from way back. So what's that connection?
Yeah. So Betty was with the City of Waterloo. What was your title at the City of Waterloo?
Manager of Culture and Festivals.
And this was at a time when, and this is, you only realize in hindsight what you've lost when people like Betty Anne Keller, or I'll say Philip Bast at the Kitchener-Waterloo Region Record, are accessible. You can call and they'll answer the phone and they'll talk to you and they're happy to help you out. And things can happen, right? Because you're there.
I totally remember that Jay Semco experience that we shared, Marshall. I still have a vivid memory of sitting at my desk and being able to say, you know what, I can do $400. And I think what I said was come up with an expense with an invoice that I can pay on your behalf. And I've recently heard you comment about Jay Semco on the Northern Pikes, and I thought, yay, I was a part of that.
Well, yeah, that was such a special experience. I grew up like the biggest Northern Pikes fan. In fact, I still say my favorite Canadian band of all time is the Northern Pikes. Mm-hmm. So to meet your musical hero and then make a documentary about him and bring him to the Princess Cinema on a frigid night in January 2005. And I needed every cent I could get to make this happen. And Betty Ann was an integral part of that. And that was like just something you could never imagine happening. You know, sometimes these things you never dreamed, could happen. And when they all fall into place, they do. And that's a big part of how community can, help each other out and make something like that happen.
Mm-hmm.
But I think it's important for the municipalities to be able to provide that kind of flexibility. And the closest thing we have right now is the Region of Waterloo Arts Fund, which provided me with a grant of $10,000 in the spring. And that was really the incentive that gave me a bit of a bonfire to get moving on finishing the project. As you know, Marshall, you and I, what date was that in the coffee shop? It was certainly before I retired in 2013 when we talked about, I was getting ready to retire at that point, and I did retire in 2013. And one of the first things I did was to start to capture oral histories from some of the people who had been involved in the live music picture in the 60s and 70s, because we're all getting to a certain age, and there's no guarantees that we're going to be around for more than, or have the brains to be able to pull it all together. So the Commons Studio was fantastic about making the space and the resources and the equipment available. And at that point, I did interviews, besides with Gary Stewart, who is an amazing person on camera. You just flip the switch and he goes.
Yeah.
I also at that time talked to Joe Risha and Gil Zerbrig from Sam the Record Man. And we took the equipment out to talk to Grant Hoffman, but getting those stories down felt really important to me. And that was in 2014. But at that point, I got distracted by the Region of Waterloo Arts Fund because I was recruited to chair the board. And that became a little bit of a part-time job between 2015 and 2019. And I really didn't have time to think about anything else. But when the pandemic struck and I saw what was happening with the live music scene, I was completely inspired to take the material that I already had. And I had been aware of these filmmaker guys, Paul Campsell and Tom Knowlton, and I'd seen some of their work, and I thought, these are the guys I need to work with to make this film, because not only do they have a community orientation, but they're total music heads. And they did this wonderful film that celebrates the Blues Festival. So we formed what we loosely call an artist collective, the three of us, for the purpose of producing what started out to be a 30-minute documentary. And as I said, the 10,000 from the Arts Fund was the catalyst. And people say, oh, how wonderful, you got a grant. But I have to confess that my reaction when I got the letter was to think, oh, shoot, now I have to actually do it.
I love your honesty, Betty, and I think that's fantastic.
So that was a year and a bit ago. And it's been really, really interesting and really, really challenging to pull together the resources, and to try to make this happen during the pandemic is just so challenging. It's really, I'm grateful that at age 74, I have a challenging project to sink my teeth into, but I'm really sympathetic to people who are trying to be presenters at this point. Looking at Paul Maxwell at Maxwell's Music House, it's brutal. He's been shut down for months and months, and the bill for the rent comes in. Anyway, that's my ramble about how I got to this point.
We're looking for ramble. Don't worry.
Yeah. Okay. Ramble on.
The other kind of milestone was that as the three of us started to work together on stuff and the stories came out, we agreed that it would be wonderful if Denise Donlin would agree to be interviewed, because Denise was the programmer at the University of Waterloo in the late 70s. And the story that's really compelling is that she left that job to go to work for Feldman in Vancouver, and onward from there to have a brilliant career in the music business. And a woman in the music business in senior positions is such a rare thing in our world that, of course, I wanted to reach out to her and see if she would participate in the project. It was very gratifying that she remembered me from the days that she was working in Waterloo. And in fact, there's a little note in her memoir of the work that Joe and I did around some of the college entertainment conferences and the block booking that we did here locally, and So when I said, Denise, do you remember me? She, of course, said, yes. And by the way, you're in my book. So
fantastic.
Yeah. So in September, we went to Denise and Murray's house in Toronto and sat in her back garden. And we had given her 4 questions to look at in advance. And I was blown away when I saw that she had pages and pages of notes that she had prepared for the questions that we put in front of her. And she talked for 45 minutes. And she's a journalist. She's a television personality. So she was poised. She was articulate. She spoke in sentences and paragraphs. And when the 3 of us left her house that day and walked out to the cars, we looked at each other and we said, we can't do 30 minutes. This has to be a 60-minute documentary. Mm-hmm. So back to the budget sheet, rework everything and regroup. A pivot is the big word in the pandemic, isn't it? Well, we pivoted from a 30 to a 60-minute documentary. And that's been the direction that we've taken since September. So here we are in February, and the film is almost done. We're just in the final edits right now. And I'm just at the point where we're sorting out the dates to fit around the Omicron variant, and God knows what else is coming down the pipeline. But we're just at the stage where we're trying to strategize the best date for a premiere weekend. The Princess Cinema has been very generous about sponsoring space and time for us. So we've got 2 screens at the Twin Cinema on a Thursday night, and then matinees on the Saturday and Sunday. So whether we do that February 24th, 25, 26, 27, or whether we pivot to dates in March or April is the question that we're grappling with right now.
It's so frustrating because you're working so hard that we had light at the end of the tunnel at the end of last year. And just like many of the bar owners, chefs, performers that we've talked to, I mean, one of them even just said, I think it was Kip Saunders from Sugar Run had said, pivot's now a dirty word. When we hear it, we cringe. We don't even know what the next pivot might be. And
exactly.
I can't imagine the emotional roller coaster that takes on the end of the project for you.
Well, it's still exciting. And of course, I'm anxious to share the film, and I've been working hard on promotion. And thank you for inviting me to talk about my project. But I think the point is that I want the film to be part of a new community discourse about why live music is such an essential piece in the cultural picture. So reaching as many people as possible is obviously part of the objective. Obviously ticket sales are nice, but frankly, that's not my focus right now. It's just reaching audiences. So I'm very happy to say that the music department at Wilfrid Laurier University loves my film, and they say it's a total fit with their community music program. So they've come on as a sponsor, which means a little bit of cash, but it also, more importantly, means that they really want to engage with the film and with us as a way of reaching, for example, music students and enriching their community music curriculum. So that is so exciting to me. And for example, one of the things we're talking about with them is doing a private screening. And I still have contact with the man who was the programmer at Wilfrid Laurier back in the day. And he's agreed to come along as an alumnus of Wilfrid Laurier to be the host for the screening of what happened at Wilfrid Laurier in the 60s and 70s. So it's turning into quite an interesting community initiative. It's not a film just for entertainment or for education or for history. I'm hoping that it will be a tool for community engagement and community development on the live music side.
I imagine there'll be a lot of music fans who are just wowed by little factoids and things about the 1970s in this area and what came through town. I find, a lot of people know, well, yeah, Led Zeppelin played the Kitchener Auditorium, and so did Kiss and Supertramp, but there's things I'm still learning. Like it was only a while ago I learned that Neil Young played Wilfrid Laurier University, or just this past year I was on eBay and there's a very expensive bootleg of a Frank Zappa concert that says Waterloo, Ontario, Canada. And I was like, Frank Zappa. And I went to Mark Logan at Encore Records. I said, and Encore has always carried a huge Zappa catalog for CDs. And I said, have you ever seen this bootleg? And he goes, no. And I said, did you know Zappa played University of Waterloo? And he said, yeah, I had heard that. But it's just little snippets of information you either hear and you can either confirm or not confirm. But I think, anyways, I'm just basing this on the fact that that's one of the things we talked about all those years ago when we sat down was you were had tons of information on bands that came through that I had no idea of.
Yeah, and there's artifacts all over the internet. Every once in a while, I see a poster come up, and it's very tempting to have it to add to my collection or to enhance the images in our film. But quite often they're quite expensive. But Ethel's has, of course, Glenn bought a lot of the posters and flyers and things from my ex-husband Joe Risha, because Joe kept everything. and Glenn picked it up and framed it. And so a lot of what I would say evidence of the stuff that played here is hanging on the walls at Ethel's. Mm-hmm. But what I find interesting about that historical part is that in 2022, the people who have recently come to work in Waterloo Region because of all the economic growth have no idea of what happened in the 60s and 70s and the innovation that came out of the universities at that time on the music side of things was extraordinary in Ontario and in Canada. Because not every university has somebody like the people who were there at that time to take those chances. One of the stories that Joe tells in the film is that when he was an engineering student at the University of Waterloo in 1966, he came on campus and there was absolutely nothing to do. Nothing.
Which is always a recipe for disaster for young people.
So he had 500 students with him in the engineering class. At that time, it was a class 68. And he collected 25 cents from every engineering student. And they had a dance at Seagram Stadium, and it was the Ardells. And that was the beginning. They had a ball. They made a little bit of money. They said, let's do it again. And eventually, the Federation of Students got involved, and the Federation of Students was collecting student activities fees at that time. So the leadership in the feds at that time, Larry Burko and Rick Page, they made the decision that their politics were kind of left. And so they said, no, if we're going to collect all these student fees, we want to give money back, or we want to give value back to the students. So Larry and Rick gave Joe a budget of something like, I don't know, $150,000, $200,000 and said, just spend it. And so Joe bought talent. And that's how all those bands played the PAC in the 60s and 70s, is that it was subsidized. So, $2 for an Alice Cooper concert or a Frank Zappa concert, as the case may be, because everything was so subsidized by the Federation of Students at that time. And in 2022, if you're a new guy that came to work at Google, you have no idea that happened. So a big part of the film is telling the history and to make the point that the kind of innovation that seems to run in the water, this entrepreneurial spirit that everybody talks about in Waterloo Region, the barn raisers mentality, actually had its roots in the 60s and 70s at the universities, at both of them, Wilfrid Laurier and UW and Conestoga College as well, because Gary was at Conestoga, of course, running bands. And I think it's important to demonstrate to the new audiences that exist in Waterloo Region that it's actually not all that hard to show the leadership and the entrepreneurship that they do in other areas. And let's apply some of that talent to the live music and the arts and culture.
Marshall and I often talk about that time. Of course, for anyone, there's some nostalgia for your youth, for the music that you enjoyed, for the times that you had with your friends and the places you would haunt. But Marshall and I often talk to guests about that rich musical culture that we had here in our youth, the 80s and 90s for us. And sometimes I think, okay, we think it's special because it's ours. Everybody thinks that their time was special, but I think I'm right here. That was a special time. The 70s, 80s, and 90s in Waterloo region was a pivotal time that brought all of this talent here in many different levels. And pandemic or not, we're just not seeing it like we used to.
No, it's true. Well, the one of the big factors is that the nature of the music business has changed so dramatically over that period. Speaking of subsidies, in the 60s and 70s, early 80s as well, the record companies were funding a lot of the touring, right? And making it up in record sales afterwards. But then that game changed dramatically. And Gil Zurbrigg, when in his interview, he says that he saw the writing on the wall when CDs started to show up in the stores because you could copy a CD. And then, pirated recordings started to come into the marketplace as well. So the game changed. But my argument and my thesis and my point is that live music still has an intrinsic value in and of itself. And the evidence here in Waterloo region is organizations, opportunities, venues like the Jazz Room, for example. Could the Jazz Room have happened anywhere else? The Music Room, Jan Narvison's thing on Yonge Street. The success of the Blues Festival with all the sponsorships. There is the Registry Theatre and all the, Isabel Cisterna and the Kulturen Festival. The festivals and the dedicated venues tell me that there is still a huge appetite for live music and the live music experience. And audiences include multi-generational people, right? Like it's not just the boomers like me who show up. It's the boomers plus their adult kids, plus their grandchildren. And so if you look at the audience for the Blues Festival or any of those venues that I just named, they're everyone. And so the foundation, here's my picture. The foundations that were laid in the 60s and 70s, the creation of all those fans, those music fans, we're now bearing we're enjoying the fruits of all that investment, that early investment in the music picture. But it's going to take diligence, and there has to be a curatorial aspect to what happens next. Because if all the musicians end up working at Amazon, we got nothing. We've already lost the Mill Race Festival in Cambridge for lack of volunteer support or burnout, if you will. Rhapsody Barrel Bar on King Street, and who knows what other music venues we're going to lose over the next 12 months because of this thing.
I got to interview Susanna Hoffs of the Bangles, and we talked about the Paisley underground scene in California in the late 70s, early 80s, I guess, and how there were these amazing female bands. And she described it kind of like how it's like waves of an ocean, like a music scene can kind of come in like a wave and then kind of recede. And by the mid 90s, when I was enjoying so many concerts at the Volcano and Stages and Club Abstract and Mrs. Robinson's, and then going to London for Call the Office and Guelph Club Denim, I had no idea that it would only be a short time. It wouldn't be very long after that for some reason, something receded. These venues started, these bands stopped coming, and these venues stopped existing. And I know I've heard when we interviewed Gary Stewart, who ran the Super Skate 7, the Vid, the Twist, Flying Dog, and Revolution, we really got a sense of what an incredible grind that is for these bar owners. And and Gary, it was brutal hearing it, even though Gary would tell you it was an absolute blast. Just the whole, you have to sell enough beer to pay for the band. You have to sell enough tickets to get the next, anyways, over and over and over again.
But that model doesn't work anymore.
No. And do Do you feel like you've gained some kind of insight on why something like a music scene or music venues can recede from a city, despite its population still growing, right? So it's not like the city's getting smaller. That's
where public money has to come into the picture. The arts generally, not just music, but the arts of every theme and activity, always must be subsidized. This is, and I will go to my grave with that belief system. Yes, there are corporate sponsorships. Yes, there are volunteer activities. But there always has to be subsidies for the arts. And the communities that have been most successful in developing a cultural scene have those values embedded in their belief systems. And I'm talking about the UK, and I'm also talking about Quebec. We only have to look up the river to see where government subsidies can have a direct impact on the quality of life that's available. So I'm really glad we have the Arts Fund, and I'm glad we have local government that supports the arts. But now that I'm no longer employed by the city of Waterloo, I can say that it's long overdue that Kitchener-Waterloo and Cambridge need to start collaborating in a more meaningful way to provide effective funding for the arts. So that's my sermon of the day. But it's what I really believe. Being in government and in a government position for 16 years taught me that in spades, is that there's an awful lot of people who fall through the cracks because the cities are not working together, and everybody worries about their own uptown or downtown for cultural revitalization instead of looking at the big picture. Because audiences don't see the boundaries. Only the governments see the boundaries.
Especially during the past couple of years, during this pandemic, nothing has been more true. Yes, we've needed technology. Yes, we have needed healthcare, and we've needed everything, in abundance. But what did everybody turn to? Books, music, paint nights, puzzles, games, movies. I mean, you name it in the arts, and that's what people turn to help them through this time. And also for those who weren't working, to fill the time, perhaps, and everybody wants it when they need it. And in times of great stress and turmoil, we have to create it. That's where the best art comes from. And that's where the most important art comes from, but nobody wants to pay for it.
Nobody wants to pay for it. That's right. Can I talk a little bit about human creativity?
Please. That's what our favorite topic.
The nature of human beings and the capacity to create magic has been my motivator through my whole working life. When I was a kid, I was the girl curled up in the corner of the library reading everything around me. And my first choice of career was to be a high school English teacher, because I was so passionate about the experience of reading something so special that I wanted to share that with the rest of the world. I was very young. I was 21 when I walked into a classroom for the first time. So that lasted for about 3 years, because I realized that I was pushing a rock around and it wasn't satisfying enough for me. But that was my motivator. What was happening at home was that my husband was doing all this interesting stuff with live music and concerts, and running buses to concerts in Buffalo and Montreal and other places. So it was 1972 when I shifted to becoming a helper to him, and then later a concert promoter on my own steam, as we continued into the 70s and 80s. And the first concert I remember being completely responsible for on my own was a Joni Mitchell concert at Wilfrid Laurier. And Joni came with a band called Tom Scott and the LA Express. And it was this big jazzy sound behind Joni Mitchell. It was not the Joni Mitchell that we understood and knew and loved, but it was such a memorable experience musically and in every other way that I was completely hooked. So being able to bring creative people with like these musicians and put them in front of an audience, the transformation that takes place when there's a live music experience in both the artist and in the audience has always been my motivation. It's great if you don't lose money. It's better if you make a little money, but that has never been my motivator for any of that. So after my husband and I separated in 1989, my work then moved to working more closely with the artist that would hire me for various services. So I was on the road with the Rankin family and Rita McNeil in the early 90s, and then ultimately went to work for Lorena McKenna in Stratford, arranging her national and international touring. My point being, it was very satisfying to work so closely with artists who actually had something to say. And being able to make that happen for audiences all over the world was so satisfying. And I don't think I could have worked for anybody whose music I didn't appreciate and value, if you know what I mean. Which means that I was never going to be hugely successful in the music business, because you just have to, Denise tells a wonderful story of how the first tour she was responsible for was White Snake. there are wonderful stories in her book of being on tour with these guys.
I bet.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, so that's my story, and human creativity and the experience of making something and sharing it with somebody else has always been my driver, my motivator, if you will.
When you were making this documentary, is the story that you end up telling at the end, is that the story that you had imagined originally, or did it kind of take some turns along the way and you realize, oh, actually I think we need more of this, or maybe this is something we need to explore a little bit more?
Yeah, the final edit will mean that we close the gaps. The tool we have for that is voiceover narration, right? We had some amazing interview subjects for this documentary, and that's really the heart of the film, is the stories that these people have told, and they're all players, either from the past or the present of the music business. And Gil Zerbrig is a person who he's so interesting, because he's not only a musician, he's a bass player, but his business experience in running the Sam the Record Man store is such a great example of how the music business has changed over the past several years. And Gil tells stories about the changes in the industry, and that when, for example, videos started to be part of the picture, he was discouraged by how the sound changed, because his motivation was that the sound of the music was what kept him going. And he loves the music of the 60s and 70s because he feels there was more creativity that was going on at that time. But when videos started, he said, it became about how your hair was done instead of the music that you were making.
Yep.
But Gary Stewart, as an impresario and as a presenter, he talked too about how music drove the culture at a certain period, and how that has changed somewhat, and that music doesn't drive the culture anymore. But that's not to say that live music doesn't have value, but it's different than it was in the 60s and 70s. Grant Hoffman is one of our interviews. He was Grantley, or the host on Canadian Bandstand at CKCO back in the day. And Joe Risha tells stories from his days as a presenter at the University of Waterloo. And of course, Denise Donlan brings a perspective from so many different aspects of the music business. But we wanted her in the film because her stories from her time at the University of Waterloo really paint the picture of the transition out of the 70s. And when Denise left the University of Waterloo, for example, she went to work for Sam Feldman on the West Coast, and she was thrown right in at the deep end, because the first thing Sam did was to put her on tour with White Snake. So as a woman in the music business, she had trial by fire for all the gender problems that existed for women in the late 70s, early 80s as well. Thank heavens that's changing a little bit. But But the star of the documentary, from my perspective, is our young musician, Matt Weiniger, who is, believe it or not yet 30 years old. And he's such a fan of the music of the 60s and 70s because he recognizes that there was able to be more creativity in the music of those years because of the subsidies that the record companies were providing. Record companies actually had artist and repertoire departments in those years. For them, for everybody, for the musicians and for the record companies, it was worth investing in the talent. And I'm not sure that to what extent that happens anymore, but Matt is a spokesperson not just for the music of that time, but for the other young musicians that are trying to make a living as professional musicians here in Kitchener-Waterloo. And he's committed to being a professional musician. I think he had his first gig at the Blues Festival when he was 16 or 17 years old. So he's been churning it out during the pandemic with videos online and stuff, but we were really pleased that we were able to get an interview with him, and we're using a lot of Matt's music in the film as well. So there's a strong local story from the music scene. And Matt tells me, when I asked him the question, how do we revive the music scene here in Kitchener-Waterloo, he said, we already have a music scene. Which was very encouraging.
I've heard that from younger people too. And Marshall and I have said to each other, wait a minute, are we at that spot where we just don't know where it is? Is that what's happening?
Well, I almost wonder if there was a point where something was even severed. I think about the end of Echo Weekly and Id Magazine, those fanzines. And I know that you can say, well, look what came out of that period of time, the Kitchener Blues Festival and that. But I almost wonder if there was points where the new concert promoters or venues felt like it was almost like having to start over, that there wasn't a connection any longer from the past to the present.
And a lot of that has to do with funds.
Interesting.
Money, right? Like the record sales and the CD sales and all of that. Well, I guess CD is where it sort of dropped off. That the money was pumping in to make these, to contribute to all these different facets.
Yeah.
And
I also,
that change shifts, right?
Betty, I can't believe that at one point downtown Kitchener had Sam the Record Man, Dr. Disc, Encore Records, Records on Wheels, 2 Sunrise Records, I think 2 A&A Records. Like, just,
it's a great observation.
Yeah.
And we haven't,
to be a kid.
Collectively, we have not resolved the streaming, the value of streaming. I know my former employer, Lorena McKenna, has been politically very active in Ottawa to try to advocate on behalf of creatives of all ilks, not just musicians, but also other artists, and the whole question of intellectual property and how to be appropriately compensated for intellectual property is a big topic. And I don't have the answers, but I hope that my film will contribute to a community conversation about, what do we care about? Do we care only about being able to stream music in our houses, or do we actually want that live music experience? Speaking for myself, I am desperate to get into an audience seat again. I've got my tickets for Serena Ryder and April at the Center in the Square, and damn it, I will be there no matter what happens. So I don't envy people who are trying to present live music right now or trying to keep their live music venues going. It's an impossible situation, but I hope that collectively we're able to gather our resources together and do what needs to be done to keep live music as a critical part of our community's cultural scene.
Bonn Park is made possible with the support of the Kitchener Public Library and the Kitchener-Waterloo Community Foundation.
Our show is produced by Sarah Geidlinger
and Marshall Ward,
with audio engineering by Sarah Geidlinger.
Bonn Park's original music is by Alan Lung.